Good morning, and thank you for joining this live BSI webinar on COVID-19 and organisational resilience. I'm Chris Sumner-Smith, and I'm here today to help facilitate the webinar. Now, before I hand you over to the chair, I just want to make you aware that you've joined this webinar in a mute-only mode, so you cannot talk to each other or to us, as there are over 500 of you on the line today. However, please feel free to type your questions in the question box in your webinar control panel on the right-hand side. We'll do our best to answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the presentations. Additionally, due to the high number of questions we've already received when you registered, we will create an FAQ document to send you all post-webinar for those questions we don't have time to answer today. We will be recording this webinar and sending you the slides and the recording once we're finished. At the very end of the webinar, we'll run a survey to ask you what you thought of the webinar today and to let us know what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. Finally, I'd just like to mention that everything you hear today is the opinion and thoughts of the speakers and doesn't reflect the official position of the EPC, BSI or anyone else. Now, I'd like to hand you over to our chair today, Deborah Higgins, who is the Head of Cabinet Office, Emergency Planning College.
Good morning, thank you, Chris. Welcome everyone to the BSI and EPC COVID-19 and Organisational Resilience webinar. Thank you very much for taking time out to join us today on what is likely to be one of the most challenging events of our professional and personal lives, no matter where we are in the world. The BSI and EPC are happy to have teamed up to provide a series of online presentations designed to support people, teams and organisations in their approach to handling this global pandemic. I would like to introduce you to our two presenters today, both of whom I've had the pleasure of working with for many years. And as Chris has said, please add your questions as we go along and we will do our best to get to them at the end. The agenda for the morning will be for the next 90 minutes and we will, each of the speakers will speak for 25 minutes and at the end we have a question and answer session for 30 minutes. So I'd like to introduce you first and foremost to Kev Brear. Kev is the Director of Consulting, Technology Risk Management for Xcina Consulting Limited, where he leads on crisis management and business continuity. Kev is also a respected leader in national and international standards development and is currently the convener of the ISO and European Joint Standards Working Group on developing new standards on crisis management. Over to you, Kev.
Thank you, Deborah. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. So we've split this presentation into two sections, as Deborah said. I'm going to cover the crisis management piece, and Rob is going to talk to us about organisational resilience and the people aspects of crisis management and the challenges that we have now today. So without further ado, let's crack on. If you do have any questions, please just ping them across on the panel, on the chat panel. We will try and take them at the end rather than try to take them during the flow. And we have already received some F&Qs. So we'll crack on. So what are we going to talk about in my session? First of all, we're going to talk about the context of this information and where it sits in the hierarchy of protective disciplines. We'll talk about crisis management principles, the high-level things that one has to think about. And those include understanding the situation, defining appropriate objectives and strategies, thinking about the command and control and communications piece, and responding appropriately. As I've said already, we'll talk a little bit about building resilience into the crisis management team, but Rob is going to talk about that area in greater depth. And then the bit that's probably most unknown at this stage is the planning for the return to normality or new normality and the exit strategies for getting back out of this situation and trying to get our lives back to a steady and even keel. So the presentation will provide a concise and compact introduction to crisis management practices. Now, unfortunately, I don't know all you guys and girls on the phone, so we're trying to sort of set a baseline of competency, a sort of a first aid approach to the current challenges. And though we're very much aware that many organisations have invested lots of time and effort into their capabilities and developing their skill sets, but unfortunately some organisations have not. So the logic here is we're trying to build a baseline that everyone can get to, and then as time goes on, we will try and help organisations develop that experience and that competency. And I should actually explain a little bit about standards before we crash into this. Standards are not designed as training manuals or instruction booklets. They're actually designed for people that already have some degree of competency in the area that is under review. And then the standard is designed to provide some better practice and to build on those skills and competencies. And we need to bear that in mind as we carry on. What we'll also do is we'll share experiences and insights. So you would have seen my bio, but back in the day, I was a blue light emergency planning officer and a gold secretariat team leader. I've also been a crisis management team leader for an organisation before I went over to the dark side and became a consultant. And so what we'll talk about is the stuff that I've done well and got wrong, and share what worked and what didn't work. And because there's two ways we learn. We either learn by trial and error, or we learn from experience. And those experiences don't have to be our own. We can learn from other people's good practice. But before we crack on, let's talk about the definition of a crisis, and we'll talk about why that matters. This is from the European Standard Document on Crisis Management, which is TS 17091. And it talks about an incident and a crisis. And why this matters is that you can't use the wrong solution to try and solve a problem in front of you. Now, Rob is going to talk about organisational resilience in a moment, but I believe, and it's reflected in the guidance in 17091, that there is a hierarchy to these events. And the way I usually explain this is by using a metaphor and analogy that I'll share with you. So if one imagines a delivery van that is going to go out and make some deliveries, making sure that delivery van is taxed, insured, roadworthy, fueled, serviced, the driver is competent and qualified. That's the baseline position we start from. And in an organisation, that would be the equivalent of enterprise risk management or operational risk management. Once that delivery van goes out to make its deliveries, it goes down the road, and after a time, it breaks down and it can no longer make those deliveries. The challenges there are quite clear. The van has to be repaired or replaced to continue the work. And what we need to think about there is actually how we get that van fixed to resume the job. And that is normally an operational process. Actually, what is required is quite straightforward. It doesn't normally involve the intervention of the senior management team, but it does actually need to be done. And so that's the same as a sort of a business continuity disruption or a security incident or any of those sort of low-level, high-frequency, low to medium impact disruptions or events that we see in an organisation every single day. So the van is fixed, repaired, whatever, and continues off its journey. And it's going down the motorway and travelling at speed. As the vehicle's travelling down the motorway at speed, it then hits a patch of water and starts aquaplaning. And the vehicle is then spinning out of control and pirouetting down the motorway. At that point in time, the driver of the vehicle doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to fix the situation. So the objectives are not clear. The actions to resolution are not clear. And what needs to be done is not clear. And that is a process where strategic intervention is required. And so the top management or senior management of the team will get involved. And the objective in that process is to try and avoid a catastrophic outcome and get the vehicle back on a steady course. And then obviously, unfortunately, sometimes we have the situation where a catastrophe does occur and the vehicle crashes, rolls over, whatever. In the business world, that's either an insolvency and the organisation ceases to exist because it's no longer financially viable, or the damage that the organisation makes it untenable and it can't continue its operations. So if you think about that end-to-end process of all those various things that I've been talking about, actually joining them all together, making them work all in collaboration, making sure there's no gaps and there's no overlaps, and that everybody knows what they have to do at the appropriate time and understands what's in front of them. That is how one generates resilience, and that is how one builds resilience in an organisation, by making sure that those various response processes, protective disciplines, all hang together and function appropriately. if we can go to the next slide, please. Right, okay. Now this bit is really important for what we're going to talk about today, because it'll provide the context of where we are in relation to the COVID-19 crisis and provide some clarity about the journey that we have ahead of us. So crises have distinct phases, and by that I mean that there is an evolution over time for crises. And what you need to think about when you're understanding a crisis, actually understand where we are in the crisis. And when one thinks about one's response processes, and when one thinks about the various activities that one has to do, one has to bear in mind where we are and timing what's required in the future. And when we talk about this particular crisis, we have already gone beyond the pre-crisis preparation stage. And normally for a crisis, one would try and test an exercise, write up the plans, build the capabilities, try and prepare the organisation for the challenges that are coming up ahead of us. I think for all of us now, we're beyond that stage, and we are now actually in what is termed as the response phase, where actually what's gone wrong has gone wrong, and we're now trying to get our heads around the situation and understand what we need to do to get us back on that steady line. So in terms of this current event, we're still at that response phase. We haven't yet reached the consolidation or stabilisation phase. And in the consolidation or stabilisation phase, that means that we actually have got a grip of the situation, that we have stopped it deteriorating. And then once we have that stabilisation, then we can actually start thinking about how we recover and how we get our path back to normality. So at the moment, we're still in that response phase. Things are going to get worse, and we haven't yet reached the point where we've achieved the peak of infection. So then we can start driving down the numbers of infection and start driving down the impacts upon our lives and our businesses. So actually, when you look at the list there, we're actually quite at early stages in this crisis, and so we need to bear that in mind, and we need to think about the longevity in the future, and we need to include in our planning the potential for this to carry on for a long time and how that impacts our operations, because unfortunately people are going to get sick, and I'm sorry to say that we are going to lose friends and colleagues, potentially, and family. So we need to think about how that all will impact on our response processes. Obviously, after the consolidation stabilisation phase, there's the recovery phase. That's actually getting things back on that even keel that I was talking about. Then we talk about the return to normality. The return to normality is how we exit from the crisis, how we get back to working as BAU, and how we get back to a stable and steady working environment and life environment. And then the most important part for me is the post-crisis phase, actually learning what we did well in the response processes, what we didn't do quite so well, how we can learn and use that information, and how we can prepare for the next challenge that comes along. And I'll talk a little bit about the next challenges also in the response piece. And the first principle that we're going to talk about is actually this needs to be a team response or a joined up response. If we could have the next slide, please, Cassia. Thank you very much. So that's a very busy diagram, but actually it provides that overview of what I was talking about. Now, obviously, this schematic is written with the view of a larger organisation that actually has the people to do this. But actually, it's not just about headcount. If one thinks about the various job titles there, thinks about the various pieces that are required, actually, you could have one person doing 2 or 3 of those areas in a smaller organisation. So it's about making sure that those areas are covered and that those pieces come together to provide their view and collaborate. And for many organisations, the crisis management team will be the executive team or the C-suite. That varies from organisation to organisation. Some organisations have the crisis management team as a separate cell or group of people that are of equal stature to the exec team, because the organisation still needs to operate and continue in itself. Now, in the current situation, the daily operations of the organisation are inextricably linked with the crisis management situation. But I think a good example of an organisation that needs to think about this process is the National Health Service, because whilst the National Health Service is working very hard to respond to the challenges that COVID-19 is creating, the National Health Service still has to provide maternity services and stroke services and deal with all of the other medical challenges that we as human beings present to the NHS. And so it has still to continue its business as usual operations whilst dealing with the challenges that the COVID-19 is creating. So that's a good example of how one particular organisation has to deal with the crisis while still continue with its BAU operations and make sure that the BAU operations are running effectively as well. So there's nothing there that's particularly surprising. As I said earlier about that business continuity piece, I believe there is a hierarchy, and some commentary in social media has spoken about the way that some business continuity solutions are not quite fit for purpose in the current environment. Well, I think that's a little bit unfair, if I'm honest. People can only plan for what they perceive as the risks in front of them. And when we're talking about business impact analysis and delivering services and products at acceptable levels, and when we think about all of the various pieces that one needs to think about in delivering the response, the BIA process is not a good process for dealing with existential crises. The one thing I should say is, obviously I've used a term like facilities and security. I'd expect health and safety, all of the various bits and pieces to be in there, compliance and everything. It's not an exclusive list. But I think the one point that I would like to make here is that whilst some organisations have gone into a temporary closed down situation, the obligations and requirements for each organisation still have to be addressed. And I was going to speak about that later. It's probably a better time to talk about now. Things like health and safety, things about compliance regulations, they haven't gone away. They still have to be addressed. The government have helpfully put back some primary legislation. For example, the insolvency rules have been relaxed slightly and things like that. But most of the key legislation that we have to worry about as a nation is still in place, and we still have to worry about all of those requirements, and that ties into the objectives piece that I'll speak to in a moment. So the primary task before we get into managing a crisis is actually understanding the situation, and that sounds like quite an easy statement, but in fact it's not. There's so much information flying around at the moment. Actually trying to actually understand what's going on and how that affects our organisation is a challenge in itself. And also some of that information is coming from sources that are not reliable and are not trustworthy as perhaps we would hope. So actually there needs to be some sort of a process in the organisation where they gain an understanding of the situation, and that process through the understanding has to be looked through the lens of the impacts of the organisation itself. So when one's talking about what's happening, one has to go out into the organisation and actually understand how it's impacting the organisation. And that in itself creates quite a burden upon the crisis management team, because information flows are quite labour intensive. Putting together the shared understanding or the information picture can be quite challenging. And so that usually translates into a briefing note or somebody being able to provide a briefing. And so you need to think about who's going to do that, how they're going to do it. And one of the things that one has to do when one's running one's crisis management team is actually keep a record of this information and actually where it's come from and the information you were told. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, and how important understanding that information picture and retaining it is. Obviously, this information picture has to be refreshed frequently. Now, Normally, I'd expect to try and do that on a sort of a scheduled or timetabled process every 2 or 3 hours or every 4 or 5 hours, whatever the organisation and the crisis management team defines as an appropriate period of time for that refreshment to take place or that refresh to take place. But if something extraordinary happens, something that comes along that changes our response strategy or objectives, then that has to be escalated immediately or brought to the attention of the chairman of the CMT, and then they decide how that piece should go along. And so the key to this is to try and build a rhythm or a structure. In the midst of all this crisis, we need to try and have some sort of steady ground to build our response upon. And human beings do not like change and do not like turmoil. They like trying to bring order to chaos. And so if we can try and use things like the information briefing to create a timetable and a rhythm, that will actually help calm the situation down. And that's one of the things that we need to think about as we go through, is actually keeping the crisis management team in a sort of a stable, as lower stress, I won't say unstressed, that's the wrong word, but trying to reduce the stress upon the crisis management team and the impacts of those stress challenges. So once we understand the situation, we need to think about our objectives and strategies. Now, the objectives and strategies will vary for each organisation, but in the current crisis that's facing the UK, we have some high-level objectives that we all have to work to. And the primary objective for us all at the moment is protecting life. That's not negotiable. It's the number one objective. That's why we're doing all of the stuff that we're doing now, is to try and protect life to the best of our ability and to try and make sure that as many people that can survive this situation are able to survive that situation. The next objective is defeating the virus. Now, we do that by social distancing, following the government guidance, making sure that we all play our part in that. And I won't spend too much time on that because there's loads of information about how we can all work together and play our part in defeating this virus. However, the next bit that people are starting to talk about now, and people are understanding because of the impacts upon their organisations, is how we survive the economic impacts of the situation. We're very much still in that response phase. The economic impacts are still a great unknown. I think it's fair to assume that there is going to be some substantial economic impacts, and we have to think about how that will affect our organisations and how we as an organisation can continue to operate once this is all over, and make sure that we stay in a position to operate once this is all over. I spoke earlier about the limitations of business continuity planning. Business continuity planning is not really designed to deal with existential crises. And we're unfortunately looking at existential crisis situation for many organisations. And so that primary piece is survival for the organisation. And then once we've got through the survival piece, we can talk about how we move on and how we can then get out the other side and go on to thrive. So the objectives that we come up with to support these primary objectives should be realistic, they should be doable. They should all be in line with the values and ethics of the organisation, and we should be cognizant of our social responsibilities and how we actually deliver our solutions. And the bit that I was alluding to in the previous slide, when we are developing our objectives and actions and decisions, we need to make a durable record for this, because after the event, we may be challenged, called upon to account for why we've done certain things. And that may be an inquiry, that may be a review, that may even be, heaven forbid, a civil court action. So we need to think about actually what we've done, why we've done it, and how we've done it, and make a record of that. And the thing that I would caution here is an academic term called hindsight bias. And that is where a situation with the benefit of hindsight looks really dumb. However, at the time, the crisis management team could have made that decision in a perfectly justifiable manner based on the information they were presented with at that time, and it would be an appropriate decision because of the information at the time. So actually recording actions, recording the decisions, and recording the context in which those actions and decisions were made is really important, because we're thinking about actually how we build a defensible position for the organisation should we have to account for what we've done and why we've done it after the event. So, command, control, communications. We understand the situation, we've set our objectives, we've decided what we're going to do, and we've decided the strategies that we're going to put in place to meet those objectives. So once we've done that, we need to then actually communicate that information. And so we need to have in place a structure to disseminate the information to our colleagues in the organisation, and that structure has to be a two-way flow of information. So when we push out the instructions, we need to make sure that the instructions are received, understood, and actioned. And as a crisis management team, we should also be checking to follow up and make sure that the progress is unfolding as we hoped or anticipated. And also the colleagues in the organisation need to be able to escalate where they hit problems, and they need to make sure that they have an escalation route if they require extra resources or they can't deliver the required action. And without that information flow, then things will not happen as we planned. So once we've got the internal piece done, which is probably the most important piece, if I'm honest, the next piece, which is also very important, is make sure that we get our messaging out to external parties and stakeholders, such as our customers, business partners, and other important people. And I'm sure that you've all received loads of information in your mailboxes from various organisations that you're a customer of, telling you how they are responding to COVID-19 and telling you how they are taking it seriously and what their expectation is for you and how it will impact their relationship with you. That's very good. And there are some textbook examples flying around at the moment of that sort of information, so that as a customer, I know what is doable and what is not doable, and where the organisation's priorities lie, and what I can basically get supplied with or not, as the case may be. The messaging needs to be consistent and coherent. Some organisations have a process where the CMT leader approves all the messaging. That works for many organisations, but I would caution that actually we need to make sure that the CMT itself is not overwhelmed with tasks. So it may be appropriate that the CMT delegates messaging to the communications team, and provided the communication team understands the strategy, understands the key message points that the CMT wants to get out, how it achieves that, how it actually pushes that out, can be led down to the communications team. Obviously, I said earlier that this presentation was meant for organisations of varying capabilities. There is a mnemonic for communications, which is ABC, which is accuracy, brevity, and clarity. When you're pushing out your messages, regardless of the target audience, if you can try and bear in mind that high-level mnemonic of accuracy, brevity, and clarity for your communications, then that's not a bad way to carry on. And the piece here from a technology perspective, the thing that I am personally most worried about is if in the midst of all this chaos, we have another WannaCry type situation, because at the moment technology is the single point of failure we're all relying upon to make sure that the UK PLC can continue to operate. So when one's thinking about your communication structures, you need to think about alternative messaging platforms. Don't just depend on Microsoft Teams. Also put in place alternative structures using a mobile platform or something like that, so that, heaven forbid, the primary communication structure fails, there is a fallback facility that everyone knows it's there and it's been tested and validated to prove that it works, so that the organisation doesn't miss a beat. I am aware of one organisation in the NotPetya situation that, because of its email, Teams and everything was taken out, they ran their organisation for about a fortnight on a secure WhatsApp group because they had no other communication structure. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it did the job, and it got them out of a particularly challenging period. And I've already spoken about messaging being two-way, but I really need to reiterate how important that is. The CMT will quite happily push out messages and actions And unless someone escalates that something is not working as planned, they will not be aware that their strategies are not being delivered in the way that they viewed or hoped. So Rob is going to talk a bit about resilience. In terms of the pieces that we all need to think about, I've already alluded to the fact that another crisis could happen or strike an organisation in the midst of this current one. I think that's a realistic risk. I think that when organisations are thinking about what could go wrong to them, in addition to it, they should actually think through and talk through some of the challenges. There is a potential risk that organisations get tunnel vision around COVID-19. The other challenges that our organisations face, they haven't gone away. They could still hit us. And so actually, whilst we're dealing with COVID-19, actually understanding the capabilities to have a business continuity solution for those minor disruptions, all of that's still there, and that hasn't stopped. And so that needs to be borne in mind. In terms of the psychological challenges to the CMT, this could be quite a challenging period. And so we need to think about how we limit that impact upon the CMT. So that means that the CMT needs break periods, they need rest periods. Because we are dealing with a medical challenge here, we could have the situation where we lose members of the CMT because they are taken ill themselves. And so we need to make sure that we have fallback situations and that we have the capability to deal with situations of protracted period. So I've already spoken about the return to normality and exit strategy. At this point, it's still much of very unknown, but it doesn't mean that we do not have to think about it. We have seen some organisations where they have received negative feedback in social media because of some of the announcements and some of the treatment that they provided for their employees. What that means to them on the flip side of this, I wouldn't like to speculate. However, we do still have reputations. We still do have to do the right thing by our colleagues and workmates. And so actually when the CMT is making its decisions and doing its work, it needs to think about actually the downside there.
Thank you very much, Kev. That was really interesting. I like your analogy of the van. It's certainly not one I've heard before, and I was thinking you were going to talk about a grey rhino or even a black swan, but I'm very glad it was a van. The phases of the crisis, that was a really important piece to understand, and understanding that we're actually in a very early phase of the crisis at the moment, and that importance of shared situational awareness, that really struck me, as well as now that we're in the middle of this thing, is to gather all the data so that we can identify those lessons and learn from them in the future. You've heard Chris say that we're all working from home. It is frightening how reliant we are on technology to keep going at times like this, and having that backup is really, really important. And so those things really leapt out at me, Kev, from your presentation. So thank you very much. So moving on to Rob MacFarlane, our next presenter, who is well known in the resilience space. Dr. Rob is the Deputy Director and Head of Resilience Training, Doctrine and Standards for the Cabinet Office Civil Contingencies Secretariat, and this role includes oversight of the EPC. Rob's responsible for the UK Government Crisis Training Programme and the development of the Doctrine, Standards and Assurance for all local resilience capabilities. Rob has been very actively involved in leading the development of British standards in crisis management and organisational resilience, and I know is extremely busy helping support the government at this difficult time. So thank you so much for taking time out today, Rob, to speak to us. Over to you.
Good morning, everybody. So just to reiterate what I'm setting out here are a set of reflections based on my own experience, and they very categorically do not represent UK government policy, just to reiterate that point at the outset. So fundamentally what I want to try and do is, against the backdrop of what Kev has talked through there, to briefly explore the human component of highly resilient organisations. I am of the view that resilience is a relative thing. You can be less or more resilient as an individual, as an organisation, as a community, infrastructure, And more broadly, I do not believe that resilience is binary. I do not believe you are either resilient or you are not. And that absolutely, I think, applies to people in the context of extremely stressful and long-running situations. So that's really what I want to try and do, is situate some reflections about personal resilience in the context of what we collectively are trying to do at a time like this, which is, of course, organisational resilience being put to quite a severe test. So I'll say something about the essence of resilience, what it is, put that in the context of crises, the kinds of specific challenges that I think we're probably all facing at the moment, and then delve into how we support our people, but ourselves as well. There's a critical component. People matter in so many different ways. That is, of course, a statement of the blindingly obvious, but I do want to unpack it a little bit for. One of the questions that I'll sort of pose at the start and come back to at the end is the question, what will you be remembered for? Not as an individual, but the organisation, no matter who you work for. It's probably worth reflecting on what will your customers, your colleagues, your stakeholders and other partners actually remember you for at the end of this crisis, about how you individually and collectively have dealt with people and the situation itself. And then I'll tie off organisational personal resilience with a few concluding comments. The reason there's a Mr. Main Character at the bottom, Mr. Nosy, is again something I'm going to sort of come back to at the end. Is I've got a habit, and I'm quite a nosy person, I think, but I've got a habit of asking if people have come to the house to install things or fix things that have gone wrong or what have you. I'm strenuously avoiding talking about specific organisations here, of course, but I've got a bit of a habit of asking them what their organisation is like to work for. And it tells you a lot. Some people have remarkable loyalty to their organisations. Some people are, at best, how should we say, unbothered by their organisation. And some are quite remarkable in how little good they have to say about their organisation. So it relates back to the point about what will you be remembered for at the end of a really tough time period. I'm not going to dip into each individual one of these pictures, and what I'm very definitely not doing is saying that any one of the implied viewpoints or popular narratives that sit behind these things are the singular correct way to think about resilience. But I'm making a broader point, which is the idea of resilience has become, I think, one much more widely thought about, talked about, reflected upon and adopted, but in really quite different sorts of ways. There are some fairly well established, top right, the inverted U, stress arousal curve, the degree to which in actual fact, if we haven't got any reason to get out of bed in the morning, many of us probably won't, but in actual fact, you can take things to a tipping point and beyond, and that tipping point is different for individual people. I think the middle point, you can't pour from an empty cup. It's one of those quite sort of neat ideas, arguably over neat, but it's one that I think feels very real to a lot of people at the moment. And of course, there's points about carrying on, sort of, carrying on and all of that sort of stuff, and the very viral nature of these mugs with the graphics on the left hand side there. And then a really interesting book about one particular unit in Afghanistan, 6 months without a Sunday, and some of the behavioural challenges, responses, I should say, to sustained stress. So there's an awful lot in both the popular and the academic literature and what have you been written about personal resilience. But I think the only thing that really I think is a constant in this is it is a very individual thing, but everybody has got their own limits, and I'll come back to that in a second. So the circular diagram on the right hand side is from the British standard 65000, the organisational resilience standard, and I'm not going to go through the loop. I'll come back to it in a second. At its core, well, I said earlier on that I was very firmly of the view that resilience is something that you can have more of or less of, but you cannot be at all times, against all potential risks and under all circumstances, resilient, full stop. I do not believe that. And I think we are all individually and collectively as organisations and networks more or less resilient. Resilience to me has got two fundamental components. There's the continuity bit, getting through bad times, typically in the short term, typically relatively rapid onset. And of course, there's the adaptability dimension. For us as individuals, teams, how we work, what we do, how we are strategically oriented, how we engage with the world around us, our ability to actually adapt to new threats, risks and opportunities. And I think both of those two things come together to define resilience. I do not believe that resilience is just about getting through the bad stuff. I do not resilience is just about toughness. It is not just about the singular things. It is actually about our ability to do those, but also to change as individuals, as organisations, as networks, to a world that is changing around us. So to go back to the wheel diagram on the right-hand side, a lot of what we talk about in resilience context, I think, is quite technical, and necessarily so. We need methodologies for horizon scanning. Situational awareness is something that uses a whole series of different data sources, gathering techniques, data fusion techniques, and again, methodologies for assessment and communication. That is necessary, that is appropriate, that is right. Strategy formulation, C3, command, control, and coordination. Whether you like those terms, whether they resonate with you or not, they are all, we do broadly similar things across our organisations and networks to understand situations, decide what we're going to do about it and implement that, and they are fairly technical in their nature. They need to be integrated, and contingency planning is something we've all done an awful lot of in the past. But as a statement of the blindingly obvious, people matter absolutely throughout all of these things, everywhere and every way, and all of the time. We cannot do crisis management, we cannot build more resilient organisations without a very, very close and sustained focus on ourselves, our people, and the people in the other elements of the network that we depend upon. So crises. Kev's talked a lot about crises there. I'm certainly not going to cover the territory again, but I think it's probably worth running very, very briefly down the list on the left-hand side there. What are the things about crises that make them difficult? Really, really difficult. Uncertainty is something that many, many people find very uncomfortable, and I'm certainly of the view that if you are completely comfortable with uncertainty, then you probably haven't entirely understood the question. The nature of many crises is that they are complex. They are simply not straightforward things where intervention A will have effect B, and you can be completely confident of that. And again, that complexity links to uncertainty. A lot of crises are frightening. The level of public concern around COVID-19 and the fact that it will affect people that we know, it may well affect ourselves. And as the Prime Minister has been very, very clear, it could have extremely serious consequences for us individually, in our family, and our broader social context, let alone looking at the nation state level. There's a lot that is frightening about the current time. And if we forget about the effect of that on ourselves and our teams and other people we work with, then that is a deeply unhelpful thing. So crises, to accelerate through the risk a little bit, they are fundamental. Kev talked about this. They can define your organisation. You may not necessarily be remembered for all the good stuff you did day after day, but if organisations do badly manage crises, then that can become absolutely defining. They're often enduring, they go on for a long period of time. We are in for a long haul. The Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, has talked about this being a marathon, not a sprint. He is absolutely, of course, right on that one. It's enduring. That consequently becomes exhausting, and it's heavily scrutinised. Some of us, some of our organisations are being challenged. That is absolutely right and proper, but that is for many people another source of stress in itself. Failing people. Crises affect people outside the organisation. If we fail people through incompetence or negligence, we collectively as an organisation will rarely be forgiven. I'm not going to talk about individual examples of that, but my point is, I bet you can. I bet you can think of an organisation which badly mishandled a crisis, and they may no longer exist. Kev talked about crises being existential, and that is the point I'm making. You will be able, in fairly vivid terms, to think of an organisation very rapidly, or a number of organisations, which got this badly wrong. And the public, stakeholders, shareholders can be very unforgiving where this is the case. In terms of the cause of crises, very rarely are crises just singularly just to do with a thing failing. a system failure or what have you. People who've researched this a lot talk about socio-technical systems. Most of the systems that we use, whether they are for information fusion, decision support, or what have you, they are where kit and people come together. And in actual fact, it is typically at the interplay between those that things do go wrong. One of the points of reference that I've used for many, many years now, and I commend it absolutely to you, is Charles Haddon Cove QC's report into the loss of the Nimrod XV-230 over Afghanistan in 2006. If you simply Google the Nimrod review, you will find it on GovUK pages. It is a long report, but it is one of the neatest summaries of how risk can build up, can propagate within an organisation, and in actual fact, how leadership, both at the risk management space and in responding to crises, is so absolutely vital. Socio-technical cause of crisis. I've talked before about how some of these things are very visible, and when people get this wrong, it can be very obvious. So crisis management is done by people, sometimes well, sometimes badly, is hardly a breakthrough moment. I get it. The next point down, I think, is an absolutely vital one, which I do want to dwell on. Crises do affect people inside the organisation. They affect you, they affect me, they affect the people around us, they affect our leaders, they affect the people, who are working to us. It is very, very easy to underestimate this. Some organisations have culture which are much more sharing and open to a discussion about mental health and well-being. That is, I think, an incredibly healthy thing. Other organisations are not quite as good at this, but it is incredibly easy to underestimate the finite nature of human resilience, and in actual fact, in some cases, the fact it is quite a fragile resource. And by fragile, I would mean once broken, it takes a long, long time to recover, if it can at all. The point, the long list of things to the left of the graphics in the previous slide talked about the various things in crises which are tough, they're difficult. And of course, they all intersect with a whole bunch of, how we are actually wired internally, psychologically, what psychologists call heuristics and biases. We're much more comfortable with familiar risk than that which is unfamiliar, pertinent at the present time. We're much more comfortable with the risks we take rather than are imposed on us, pertinent at the time. Vividness, where crises are made very real in our minds, whether it's accurate or not is not material, but if they're given a vividness, then they are inherently more fearful. Things that are predictable, we find it psychologically much easier to cope with. The people around us, the people who work to you, the people you work to, find them easier to deal with as well. We are not in predictable times at the moment. And something that is statistical, you have a 1 in X chance of Y, is much, much easier to rationalize and deal with than somebody talking about their brother, their aunt, or what have you, something that makes it very personal. It may be anecdotal and non-statistical, but things like that do psychologically hit us quite hard. So I dwelt on that for a moment because I do think it's really, really important to acknowledge that all of this that's going on at the moment is affecting all of us as leaders, as operators within organisations, large, medium or small. And this is where leadership absolutely matters vitally. So the table at the top is a breakdown of how we would think about capability in simple plain English, an ability to do something. We need an awful lot of different capabilities to have a resilient organisation. So the human components of resilience, capability laid out in fairly sparse terms on the right hand side, but the comments underneath where I want to dwell for a moment is much more than having just enough people. This is not just a capacity thing. So we would define as capability as the ability to do something, and capacity in terms of how much of that thing. It's much more than simply having enough people. It's also more than just having the right people. What you really need are enough of the right people. Again, that's hardly a breakthrough point, but at this time that we are suffering high levels of staff absence for all sorts of different reasons, then in fact that becomes, for large and small businesses and organisations aside, a really tough. I think squaring the circle might be the appropriate phrase. And then you need to develop them. KSOB: knowledge, skills, attitudes and behaviours. You can teach people things quite quickly. People can learn things quite quickly. Skills can be developed, depending on their complexity, relatively quickly. But attitudes are the really underlying stuff that shape behavior. And if you get people around you with the right attitude and the right instincts, then they are worth an immense amount. A couple of examples of that: attitudinal or instincts to not take things for granted, to check assumptions, to think not just about what we're doing and how we're doing it, but why we're doing it, constantly checking the strategic position. And one of my particular points, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So on assumptions, Kev talked earlier about ABC being accuracy, brevity, clarity. When they're training detectives, then it is assume nothing, believe nobody, check everything. It sounds all rather nasty, but it's not a bad set of principles. And looking after people is absolutely vital. So I'm going to say it's dead easy and actually unhelpful to overgeneralize or be simplistic about this, and then I'm going to probably be simplistic and generalize a little bit much about it just now. But I think the key point here is we're all different, but everybody does have their limits, and that applies absolutely to leaders as well. So one of the graphics that appeared in an earlier slide was that bell curve, the inverted U stress arousal curve, which was the point that there's a tipping point. There's a tipping point about the point at which people are actually under a sufficient amount of tempo and pressure that they're focused, but actually it goes through a point that they become overloaded, and you began to see things like attentional narrowing, the inability to pick up more peripheral but potentially vital signals, impaired decision making. And one of the things that happens at that point is the task team self framework is incredibly well established, but thinking about the team, thinking about the people alongside you, people find it much easier to continue focusing on the task. They find it reasonably easy, not always, to think about themselves, but it's that thought that's been given to the team around you. And as a leader, that is fundamentally what you are there to do. So you cannot lose focus on that. So Kev talked about hindsight bias, and Atul Gawande, the guy who wrote the Checklist Manifesto, is referred memorably, at least to me, about smart people doing dumb things. A really helpful little reminder that you may be very well qualified and experienced, but once you get past that tipping point, you are going to do potentially dumb things as well. So no one's immune from this stuff. Nobody's immune from stress, and we've all got different thresholds, capacity and coping strategies, and they lie in different places with different people, but they are there. One of the themes and memes that was used at the start was the you can't pour from an empty cup. And whilst simple and maybe a little bit sort of homespun in its presentation, I think it is actually an incredibly important point. You cannot, in an enduring crisis, actually start thinking for the first time in a leadership context in an organization about physical and mental health and well-being. You can support people, but you need you really need to have laid the foundations for this for this before the crisis. I think an important point is about self-awareness as well. You need to know for the people that report to you, whether it's a small team or slightly larger, what are the points at which that tipping point is exhibited for them. I know for me, it might be the presence of something, it might be the absence of something. I know for me, it's my sense of humour. If I stop seeing if I notice in myself, or my team notice the ability to spot the funny side in things, in contexts that you'd really much rather not be in, then that to me is the point at which I know I'm beginning to really do feel things. The point about authenticity in a leadership context is always a tricky one. As I'm effectively talking to several hundred strangers on the internet, I'm not going to dwell on this one. I'm certainly not going to overshare with you, but I can. I certainly did run the risk of oversharing with certain colleagues recently when we were talking about how tired we were, and I shared that I did something fairly dumb. I can absolutely reassure you that A, it wasn't at work, and B, it was entirely safe. But notwithstanding that, it was dumb. But I think there's a point there about being yourself, and also about it's okay not to be okay, and to demonstrate personally, not just in some sort of fairly anodyne managerial speak kind of way, to the point and the absolute criticality of looking after yourself and taking the time to look after yourself, to be very, very clear that if we get on the far side of that sort of stress arousal curve and we go past our own tipping points, then frankly, we're not the use to the organisation that we should be. The bottom line, get help from the professionals. Crises do have at times like this, I should say, at times like this, you see a lot of collaboration, you see innovation, you see creativity. You're seeing it in the remarkable effort to develop using completely new alliances. ventilators for health services in the UK and around the world as well. But we've also seen, and I'm very grateful for this, a lot of colleagues in the human resources space and both internationally and within the UK actually think deeply and come up with some really good, supportive, highly practical resources to help people with their mental health, well-being and welfare under times which they may be cooped up in the house for a lot of the day, they may be needing to work from home, they may be disassociated from a lot of their social networks, both familial and professional. And that adds to the toughness, the difficulty, the challenge of what I think we're all going through at the moment. So there's an awful lot of material, whether you work for a big organisation with well-resourced HR or a small organisation, then there's a lot of really good resources out there. So please do take a moment to go and find it. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. So it's the wheel diagram again. And I just wanted to try and sort of put some of those things that exist in the different spokes of the wheel into a slightly more human kind of context. So none of this is drawn directly or I suspect even particularly faithfully at the detailed level, but the spirit is absolutely the case, absolutely consistent with the British Standard on organisational resilience. I think highly resilient organisations and all of these things I think matter much more when you're under immense pressure is the connect people to purpose. It's the old why thing, why are we doing, what are we doing? And I think understanding that strategic context is much more important. It's always vital, but it becomes, if anything, more important at a time like this. I think encouraging people to do what they should be doing anyway, which is looking for trouble, actually not making a series of assumptions that all is well, but as we are all moving quickly and in uncertain times and dealing with impacts that have got unforeseen potential consequences on ourselves, then actually the requirement to not assume nothing, believe nobody, and check everything, but actually to become inquiring and challenging around assumptions becomes hugely important. Good organisations listen to themselves. They don't just talk one-way communication from the top to the bottom. They've actually got means to listen and to hear what is being said at different organisations, and that is really vital when your staff and your teams are hugely important. Put principles above rules. This is an important one to me. We are in uncharted territory in many respects, and we're having to do things not just different things to normal. We're having to do them in a different way. And actually, in fact, this is not a time to think in incredibly procedural terms. We need often to think in quite creative terms, and this is where actually principles-based decision making, rather than quite rigid standard operational procedures, become absolutely vital. There are risks in that. We completely understand that. Leaders are not singular, and at times like this, that it's absolutely vital that we think in terms of having layers of leaders across the organisation who we encourage to work on the basis of principles, apply judgment, and take measured risks in pursuit of, back to the top, connecting people to purpose, and challenge themselves. Assumption checking is not just about our engagement with other people in the outside world. It's also about being self-aware and actually challenging ourselves. So I know that the last point is quite sort of vague, that very last bullet point in the bottom of the slide, but I go back to where I started as my final point and pose the two questions. At the end of this, whenever it may be, it's worth sort of having a bit of a think now about what would your colleagues and your employees say about you as a leader, and what would they say about the conduct of your organisation. And I'm not going to try and answer that for you. It's something we think about in our own organisations. And what will you be remembered for by the outside world? And I think if we do think quite relentlessly and creatively and empathetically about our people, not just within the organisation but outside the organisation as well, then that feels like an incredibly important discipline at this point in time.
Rob, thank you so much. I think it's really interesting the times that we find ourselves in now. If we look back 6 months ago, I don't think if you had been doing a talk about organisational resilience that it would have been quite so much focused on people and the human component. Certainly back in the days of policing, for me, this was regarded as pink and fluffy stuff, and you need to stick to talking about systems and standards and processes and statistics. And it's been fascinating to me how a crisis like this really brings up the high importance of that personal and human resilience, and how, as a part of organisational resilience, it's probably the most important part of organisational resilience. And I think it's really fascinating how you focused on that today, and talked about people's attitudes and their instincts, and those really hard to measure skills and competencies that we all struggle with. I think out there, of the people listening to us, certainly in the business continuity, crisis management and incident managers, we'll all be saying, this is what we've been planning for, this is what we've been prepared for, and this is what we've been banging on about for years, is being ready for crisis and being ready for dealing with such disruptions. And I think now is our time as professionals and teams and organisations, like Rob said, to really prove our worth and to prove the value of all of the work that we've been doing. Rob, you talked about tipping points of people. And this is typically for a business continuity professional out there, that this is what we talk about, our maximum tolerable period of disruption, but actually it's our maximum tolerance as people at times like this that we really find out, and also of our customers and our stakeholders. So how we're remembered, Rob, was what you started your presentation with that question, and then how we will be remembered after, and what people thought of us before. I'm really seeing that I think the whole culture of organisations will change. We are working differently as individuals and as teams, and as organisations. You mentioned organisations collaborating more with each other that would previously have been competing. And so that survival and thriving is really in action at the moment, and it's encouraging to see that organisational resilience and personal resilience more closely aligned. But I thank you for that presentation, because I personally found that, along with Kev's crisis management one, really, really informative and interesting. So thank you so much. We've had some questions come through from the users of the registrars of this webinar before. So I'd like to come back to Kev, if that's okay. We've had a number of questions, Kev, about our ability and willingness to learn from such events, and you talked about this in your presentation. And there have been questions about why aren't we better at doing this when it comes to risk. Could you share your thoughts on how we ought to encourage organisations to adopt that more progressive and holistic approach to post-crisis learning, and not one which is just threat specific like the pandemic?
Yeah, of course I can. Thank you, Deborah. So I spoke in my presentation about the learning from what we're seeing in front of us now, and trying to share that effectively. Unfortunately, as human beings, we are quite poor at learning from failure. There has been numerous academic works going all the way back to Turner's works in 1978, when they were first published, that talk about how human beings had the warning signals of impending doom and failed to pick up on them. And so we need to actually put in place a structure, a process where we capture information and share it. But it is difficult, because the last thing one wants to do is actually bury people under a tsunami of information, because then actually the key messages and the important stuff gets lost in all the noise. And so we have to actually look at what we've done, have a discussion internally about what went well, what didn't go quite so well, a formal review type process, and produce a record of that review, and then do something about the learning, because learning only actually takes place when something is done with it. Otherwise, it's another missed opportunity. And then once we've actually done that internally in our own organisations, we need to think about how we can share information externally with our peers and business partners. And actually that needs courage and that needs bravery, because we have to be prepared to admit failure. When I did my master's, I looked at how organisations shared the business continuity information lessons learned, or lessons to be learned from 7/7, and how organisations were successful or unsuccessful in that process. The one thing I did find out of that that has been reiterated for me as time has gone on is actually how important these standards that we're talking about are in that process, because those standards are based on experience and good practice. And so actually, when you pick up 2231, 22313, 65,000, those documents are built on people's understanding and knowledge. So actually reading standards, understanding what's in them, that is a key part of the process. So it's about exchanging information, being brave and playing one's part in that process. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Kev. Yes, that does from my perspective. But like Chris said earlier, if there are questions that you've got that you'd like to share with us, we will be putting out an FAQ document at the end of this. So Rob, I've got one for you, which is we've had some optimistic questions and been asked about how we are planning for recovery in the UK and what that might look like. And in terms of that organisational resilience piece that you've talked about and personal preparedness, what should we be thinking about now for our recovery, whenever that might be in the future?
That's a really, really difficult question, and I'm conscious even at the very, very beginning that what I say is probably going to be deeply unsatisfactory, so I'm apologising in advance for that. This is taking under promise, over deliver to a whole new level, isn't it? I do think that this is going to change so many things, and a lot of commentators have talked about the way in which we will become used to certain things. For example, have developed new interests and aptitudes and tolerances for working in more distributed fashions, etc. And I just use that as one example that there's so many things about the world are going to change. A couple of ideas about resilience that I don't necessarily entirely agree with is one is sort of bounce back ability, which does tend to imply that you go back to where you started from. Not entirely, but certainly that idea of sort of getting back to normal. I think one of the things we probably all agree on is whatever future normal looks like, it's going to be different in some certain ways. It's too early to say that. That's the unsatisfactory part about my answer. It just simply is too early to say. What I can absolutely assure folks is that within government and across sectors, we and people more generally are thinking hard about what those implications will be, what the change may potentially be, and what measures we will need to enact to support the most effective recovery. So I do apologise. There's certain things we can't reasonably share in this forum, but I can give a reassurance that following a long-established principle that you don't think about recovery when something is over, you think about recovery when it is happening to you. Recovery and the emergency response run hand in hand. We are absolutely observing that principle and holding true to it now, and resolving working through many of the uncertainties surrounding the current events.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to you and all the civil servants that are working really hard behind the scenes. I know you're not the ones that have to go on TV and talk about it all, but the work that you're all doing in the background that I'm aware of is phenomenal, and I think you don't often get thanked enough for that. I'd like to come back to Kev. Kev, you talked about the challenges of technology and communications, and it is frightening how we are relying on technology hugely at the moment. So it'd be interesting on your view of that challenge of remote working and technology risk related to this. It's also related to a final question that I've got for both you and Rob at the end about what the biggest learning point is. But if you could focus on the technology risk around COVID-19 and us all working in a more distributed manner, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. My earning a living was dealing with cyber breaches and things that went wrong from that sort of type of area before COVID-19 hit us. And so I do have a bit of a focus on cyber risk and cyber resilience. So in terms of that single point of failure in technology, it's probably our most important asset at the moment, or apart from the people piece. Many organisations are depending on technology to keep the wheels turning. And so we have to make sure that we protect those assets. We have seen our friends in the criminal fraternity exploiting COVID-19 and sending out phishing emails and voice messages and text messages, trying to get people to click on links and attack systems. And before Christmas, globally, we saw that email account takeovers in terms of incident overtook the volume of ransomware for the first time ever. And for those of people on the call that are not technology savvy, if you think about your internet-based email communications, your Office 365 and Outlook, what's been happening is people's account passwords have been compromised so that third parties can then take control of those accounts, steal the information, redirect payments and things like that. So in terms of what we can do, we need to protect those assets. So if you're using Outlook 365, Outlook or Office 365, you need to make sure that the multi-factor authentication is turned on, and so that there isn't just a password to get into the account. You need to make sure that all of your security patching and improvements are in place and up and running, and you have to make sure that actually the organisation is as best prepared as it can be to protect its assets. I realise that most organisations are doing this already, but this situation just underlies just how important that is. And I'm sorry to say that people are trying to abuse the current situation and are just heaping pain upon us. And so we have to respond to that appropriately.
Thank you very much, Kev. That's really interesting. And you know, we heard earlier the challenges of working from home as well, not just with the technology, but with our families in the background.
You make a good point. This remote working thing, one of the things, and Rob alluded to it actually, and we're doing it in my own firm very successfully, actually making sure that people do keep up the relationships, even if it's just a short text message, just actually making sure that people are okay, checking in with them. And because actually remote working is quite impersonal, it is difficult. I've been doing it for many years and I've had global teams to manage from a computer, so I'm not completely unfamiliar with the process. But actually, for those of us that don't do it regularly, or it's a new experience, actually just reaching out to your colleagues, just giving them some reassurance, checking they're okay, and making sure that everything's fine. That's a really valuable piece as well. That social interaction piece has been lost for many people, and that needs to be sort of compensated for.
So we had a question for both speakers, and Rob, if I can come to you, and you've alluded to some sort of personal reflection on what your experience has been so far in this crisis, but the questions come in as to what's been the biggest learning that you have identified in this crisis so far.
I referred earlier on to capability and capacity, and we work to a general, reasonably plain English definition of capability as a demonstrable ability to do something to defined levels under specified circumstances. And capacity is intrinsically related to that, because you need to have enough of the capability for it to be able to meet the challenges against something that is incredibly unprecedented. I think, and this isn't necessarily a learning point for the future, but it is a demonstrator of what can be achieved. I think the ability of large, complex, multifaceted departmental organisations, including government, to reorient strategically what they are doing and to reorganise logistically, in resourcing terms, in what you might call command schemes and organisational structures, and indeed in their fundamental ways of working in a remarkably short period of time when they have to, has genuinely been remarkable. And I as somebody overseeing quite a lot of staff movements, have hugely benefited from that complete reorientation. So I know that's a really general point. It's simply too early to pull lessons out. Too many of the things remain unclear. The scientific evidence base is evolving, so it would be inappropriate to draw any more specific points. And we will do that extremely thoroughly and with transparency at the right time. But it has been a remarkable reflection point, more than a learning point, about how large organisations, which sometimes stand accused of being relatively rigid and inflexible, have proven themselves to be just the opposite. And that has happened in the public and the private sector alike.
Thanks, Rob. I agree. And just to share my own reflection, I work for Serco, as you know, and I've been hugely impressed, and this doesn't mean to sound creepy, but but just you learn about your organisation at times like this and how they feel about their people and how well they treat their people. And if you didn't know before, you'll know now, and you can look up and down the country and on the news as to how people are feeling about their organisations and how they're coping and surviving or not in the current crisis. So that's definitely been the theme from today that I've picked up on from what you've both said. So Kev, back to you. We've had a question about technology and critical national infrastructure and all of this. We've been also talking about standards and processes and systems. So in all of the plans that we had, in all of that work that we've all done as professionals and practitioners before, we've talked about how they're relevant, how they can be applied and how they're useful. Do you think that will change going forward of how we apply those standards, and is there anything missing in your view?
That's a great question. I think as an industry, we have been suffering, for want of a better term, of a bit of a turf war about who's got the best business continuity methodology, where resilience fits in with risk and all the rest of it. And the one thing that has come out of this crisis for me is actually how people have actually aligned their thinking to what really matters and what is important. And actually people are focusing on those big issues. It seems ridiculous to think that 12 months ago we were lost in the middle of the Brexit crisis. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, Brexit just seems like a mere kerfuffle compared to the challenges that we now face. And so all of this thinking process enables us to understand the challenges in front of us and enables us to respond appropriately. I think that standards will have a key role to play in sharing information in good practice. I think that one thing I would like to say is that more people getting involved in developing standards and working with the BSI and sharing their information. I've been developing standards for many years, but I'm always grateful when people offer up their experience and their support, particularly from areas in the CNI, the critical national infrastructure, places like that, where they're doing a pivotal job at the moment. We'd be absolutely lost without our communications providers, without our electricity providers and our utility providers. And those folks are working tirelessly to enable us all to work from home and work remotely. And without them, we'd be completely lost. And so actually making sure that we understand how they've coped and how they've built their own resilience and extrapolating their good practices, all of that adds to the picture. And I spoke to in my presentation about learning for the next time. I'm sorry to say that this won't be the last time that we have to deal with a global challenge. And so once we're out the other side of this, then we need to get ready for the next challenge. And I can't guarantee that it'll be a generation before we see that next challenge. It may come a lot sooner, but that doesn't mean that we should not be prepared for it and should not be ready for it.
Thank you, Kev. And Rob, coming back to you for the final point on the point of learning. So how do you recommend all of the people listening today can capture that learning and really make the best out of this bad situation?
Two thoughts on that. One is learning should be constant, so that there's an element of continuous improvement, which is very easy to talk about but much harder to do in practice. And then of course there is the final, almost the sort of the whatever the end of this looks like, and whenever it is, then the proper reflection, which will take place at a number of different scales within organisations and across the piece. I think the most vital point right now is to think about continuous improvement, that we work to a principle that tomorrow needs to be better than today and today should be better than yesterday. And I know that's dead easy to say, but if you go back to knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviours, then actually what you need to inculcate in people is an instinct that if something isn't right and it should be fixed, don't do fixes that impose nasty surprises on other people. And in spite of the fact that we're working in quite a distributed fashion, we've all had to evolve either on pre-existing or of new channels, work out ways of collaborating, but get people together. And as part of your normal daily cycle, have part of it which asks the basic questions of what worked well, what didn't go so well, why was that, and what should we change for tomorrow. And I think if you actually develop a habit around that, then that will be something vital to the resilience of your approaches more generally. So I'd be, I know it's a slightly rambling answer, but I wouldn't think in terms of the post-match inquiry, once this is all done, the reflection, once we've actually assembled the insights, we know what the effect of various decisions have been. That must absolutely not, I think, paralyze any of us and all of us from thinking in terms of what can we do collectively without imposing nasty surprises on our colleagues and partners to actually make tomorrow better than today. This is adaptive. We are evolving all of this. We will get things wrong. Be comfortable with that, but simultaneously be uncomfortable and intolerant of it, and try and work out a loop of improving as we go.
I'd just like to say a big thank you to our presenters and also for everyone who attended today. We've had a lot of you on the line, a lot of very good questions, as I thought really showed through at the end there. I hope you found this all useful. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar along with the slides and some supporting resources such as FAQs and ones we didn't get around to answering today. Don't forget to join us for the next webinar in this series. You can find all the details on the BSI website, www.bsigroup.com, or to continue the conversation on all the latest guidance and advice, please visit the EPC website, which is www.epcresilience.com. There are daily updates on there. And also remember that when you register for these webinars, you can take the opportunity to download a number of relevant standards at no charge for a limited time only. These are all ones that are sort of relevant to the whole business continuity, risk management, organizational resilience type sphere. But for now, I will leave you. So thank you and goodbye.